The smell of smoke still clings to her hair. 3 days since the walls fell, and Melina can still taste ash on her tongue, still feel the heat of burning timber against her skin, even though the fires are now 100 miles behind her. She is 26 years old. She is the wife of Hippocrates, strategos of the Athenian forces at Decelea. She was, until 72 hours ago, one of the most respected women in Athens, mistress of a household with 14 slaves, mother of 2 sons who are now almost certainly dead. Now she stands in a stone courtyard in Sparta, barefoot on flagstones worn smooth by generations of feet, wearing a chiton that is not hers, that was given to her by captors who stripped away everything she owned, everything she was, with the same efficiency they applied to dismantling fortifications. Around her stand 31 other Athenian women. She counted them during the march. 31 wives, daughters, and widows of Athenian officers, collected from the ruins of Decelea like grain after harvest, sorted and transported to this place that Athenians speak of only in whispers. The courtyard is larger than she expected, clean, organized, nothing like the chaos of the sack, nothing like the blood and screaming that accompanied their capture. This is a different kind of horror, she is beginning to understand. Not the horror of violence, but the horror of system, the horror of efficiency, the horror of a process that has been refined over generations to produce specific outcomes with mechanical precision. Spartan women watch from the colonnade. Melina can see them in the shadows, observing the new arrivals with expressions she cannot read. They do not look sympathetic. They do not look cruel. They look evaluating, assessing. The way a horse trader examines stock before auction. A man approaches from the far end of the courtyard. He is perhaps 50 years old, his body still hard with the muscle that Spartans maintain until death, his face bearing scars that map decades of warfare. He does not introduce himself. He does not need to. The crimson cloak marks him as one of the homoi, the equals, a full Spartan citizen with rights that extend to everything within the borders of Laconia, including, Melina is beginning to understand, her. He stops 10 feet from the group and speaks in a dialect of Greek that sounds harsh to Athenian ears, consonants bitten off, vowels flattened, every word stripped to its essence. You are no longer Athenians, he says. You are no longer wives. You are no longer mothers. Athens has fallen. Your husbands are dead or enslaved. Your children are scattered. Everything you were is gone. Melina feels the woman beside her begin to shake. She wants to reach out, to offer comfort, but she does not move. She has learned already that movement attracts attention, and attention in Sparta is never kind to foreigners. You are now property of the Lacedaemonian state, the man continues. Not slaves. Slaves have value only for labor. You have different value. You will be distributed according to the needs of the city. Some of you will be assigned to Spartan households as secondary wives. Some will be given to the Crypteia for training purposes. Some will serve in the temples. Some will be used for breeding. The word lands like a physical blow. Breeding. Melina has heard stories about Spartan practices, whispered tales that Athenians told each other to explain how their enemies could be so different, so inhuman, so terrifyingly effective in war. She dismissed most of them as propaganda, as the natural exaggeration that enemies engage in to make sense of their defeats. She is no longer certain the stories were exaggerated. The process will begin tomorrow, the man says. Tonight you will be fed and housed. You will be examined by physicians. You will be assessed by the E4's representatives. Based on these assessments, assignments will be made. He turns and walks away without waiting for response, without acknowledging that he has just reduced 32 human beings to categories of use. The Spartan women emerge from the colonnade. They are not gentle. They do not speak more than necessary. They separate the Athenian women into groups of 8, lead them to different buildings around the courtyard, begin the process that the man described. Melina is taken to a room that contains a stone table, a basin of water, and an older woman who tells her to remove her clothing. The examination that follows is thorough, clinical, and utterly dehumanizing. The woman checks her teeth like a horse buyer, examines her hips with hands that probe without apology, asks questions about her menstrual cycles, her pregnancies, her age at first marriage, whether her sons were healthy. Melina answers because she understands that refusing will not stop the process, will only make it worse. She answers because she is beginning to understand that Sparta does not care about her resistance, her dignity, her humanity. Sparta cares only about function, utility, outcome. When the examination is complete, the woman makes marks on a wax tablet. She does not tell Melina what the marks mean. She simply gestures toward a door at the back of the room, beyond which Melina can hear other women crying. "Tomorrow you will be assigned," the woman says. "Rest tonight. You will need your strength for what comes next. What you are about to learn has been systematically obscured by 25 centuries of scholarship that preferred to focus on Spartan military achievement rather than Spartan domestic practices. The historians, who wrote admiringly of Thermopylae and the 300, who praised Spartan discipline and Spartan valor, chose not to examine too closely what that discipline required, what that valor was built upon, what happened to the women and children and conquered peoples who made the Spartan war machine possible. Tonight, you will learn what Sparta actually did to captured enemy wives. Not the sanitized version that textbooks provide, not the romantic interpretation that sees Spartans as noble warriors defending Greek civilization, but the documented reality preserved in sources that scholars have traditionally dismissed or ignored because acknowledging them would complicate the heroic narrative. You will learn about the distribution system that assigned captured women to Spartan households based on breeding potential. You will learn about the Crypteia, the secret society of young Spartan warriors who used captured women for training purposes that ancient sources describe only in euphemisms. You will learn about the temple assignments, where women considered too old or too damaged for breeding were given to religious institutions that practiced forms of worship Athens would have considered obscene. You will learn why Spartan warriors were forbidden from marrying until age 30, and what they did during the 15 years between completing their military training and being permitted to take wives. You will learn about the wife-sharing customs that allowed any Spartan citizen to request access to another citizen's wife for breeding purposes, and how this same custom was applied, with modifications, to captured foreigners. You will learn about the children born from these arrangements, where they went, what they became, how the Spartan state created new categories of person, neither citizen nor slave nor free, to accommodate the offspring of enemy women and Spartan warriors. You will learn why ancient sources consistently describe Sparta as a place where women had more freedom than anywhere else in Greece, and why this description, while technically accurate, conceals a horror that most historians have been unwilling to confront directly. Subscribe if you want to understand the darkness that powered history's most celebrated military culture. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Melina is still waiting in that room, still hearing other women crying through the walls, still not knowing what assignment means, what breeding means, what the next months and years of her life will contain. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened to her. But before I reveal what the Spartans did to the wives of their defeated enemies, before I explain the system that had been perfected over 4 centuries to break Athenian women and rebuild them as instruments of Spartan reproduction, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Sparta became what it was. I need to explain the psychology of a society that could process human beings with the same dispassion they applied to forging weapons. Because you cannot understand what happened to Melina without understanding what created the men who did it to her. Sparta was not born monstrous. It became monstrous through deliberate design, through generations of social engineering that produced warriors unlike any the ancient world had seen, warriors whose effectiveness in combat was matched only by their capacity for systematic cruelty. The transformation began around 650 BCE, nearly 2.5 centuries before Melina's capture, when Sparta faced an existential crisis. The city had conquered the fertile region of Messenia, enslaving its population to work the land that fed Spartan citizens. But the Messenians revolted, and the war that followed nearly destroyed Sparta. The city survived, barely, and its leaders drew a conclusion that would shape everything that came after. Never again would Sparta be vulnerable. Never again would Spartans concern themselves with farming, commerce, art, philosophy, or any of the other activities that made other Greek cities vibrant and creative and weak. Sparta would become a pure military society, every aspect of existence subordinated to a single purpose, producing warriors capable of maintaining control over a hostile, enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans 10-1. The system they created was called the agoge, which means upbringing or raising, a term that conceals the reality of what it actually involved. Every Spartan male child was examined at birth by a council of elders. Those judged weak or deformed were taken to a place called Apothete, a chasm on Mount Taygetus, and thrown to their deaths. Those who passed this first examination were allowed to remain with their mothers until age 7. At 7, everything changed. The boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks where they would live until age 30. They were organized into groups called agalai, herds, a term that indicates exactly how Spartans viewed their children. Not as individuals to be nurtured, but as livestock to be shaped into useful form. The training that followed was designed to produce specific psychological results. The boys were deliberately underfed, forcing them to steal food to survive. If caught stealing, they were beaten, not for stealing, but for being caught. The lesson was clear. Cunning and deception were virtues. Failure was the only crime. Getting caught meant you were not clever enough to be Spartan. They were given only one cloak per year, regardless of weather. They slept on rushes, they gathered themselves from the river. They were beaten regularly by older boys and by adult supervisors, not as punishment for specific offenses, but as general conditioning to endure pain without complaint. A Spartan who cried out under the lash was considered unworthy of citizenship. They fought each other constantly. Not play fighting, but genuine combat that produced injuries and occasionally deaths. The survivors were the ones who learned to channel violence effectively, who could switch from calm to lethal in an instant, who felt no hesitation about causing harm to others. And they were systematically denied normal human attachments. No families, no personal property, no privacy, no individual identity beyond their position in the military hierarchy. The boys were taught that sentiment was weakness, that love made you vulnerable, that the only loyalty worth having was loyalty to Sparta itself, an abstraction that demanded everything and gave back only the privilege of dying in its service. By the time a Spartan male reached 18, he had spent 11 years in this environment. He had been beaten, starved, frozen, forced to fight, denied every comfort that normal human development requires. He had watched weaker boys broken by the system, had perhaps participated in breaking them. He had learned that sympathy was dangerous, that hesitation was fatal, that the only way to survive was to become exactly what Sparta wanted him to be. But the agoge was only the first stage. At 18, the young Spartans entered the Crypteia, and this is where the system produced its most disturbing results. The Crypteia was officially described as a kind of secret police, responsible for controlling the Helot population, the enslaved Messenians who worked Spartan farms. In practice, it was something else entirely. Each year, the ephors, Sparta's elected officials, made a formal declaration of war against the Helots. This declaration was not symbolic. It was a legal mechanism that allowed Spartans to kill Helots without religious pollution, without blood guilt, without any of the consequences that normally attended murder in Greek society. During this period, young men of the Crypteia were sent into the countryside with daggers and minimal supplies. Their mission was to find and kill Helots. Plutarch describes this practice with evident discomfort, noting that the Crypteia warriors would hide during the day and emerge at night to murder Helots found outside after dark. They targeted particularly strong or intelligent Helots, those who might pose a threat if they organized resistance. But the killings were not purely pragmatic. They were training. These young men, between 18 and 20 years old, were being taught to kill humans without hesitation, without remorse, without the psychological barriers that normally prevent people from taking life. They were being taught that certain categories of person, Helots, foreigners, anyone, not Spartan, existed outside the moral framework that governed relations among citizens. They were being taught that killing such people was not murder, but practice. The Crypteia lasted 2 years. By age 20, a Spartan warrior had killed multiple times. He had stalked human beings like prey. He had experienced the intimate violence of using a blade on flesh, of watching life leave a body he had personally destroyed. Whatever capacity for empathy he had possessed at birth had been systematically eliminated. For the next 10 years, he lived in the communal barracks, training continuously, participating in whatever warfare Sparta engaged in, waiting for the day when he would be permitted to marry and establish his own household. This is what made Spartan warriors so effective. Not merely their physical training, which other Greeks could have replicated, but their psychological conditioning, the systematic destruction of normal human emotional responses, the creation of men who could inflict suffering without feeling it, who could treat human beings as objects without cognitive dissonance, who had been shaped since age 7 to be instruments of violence rather than complete human persons. These were the men who processed the captured women of Decelea. These were the men who examined Melina and decided her fate. These were the men who would carry out whatever assignment the ephors' representatives determined. And the assignments, as Melina was about to learn, reflected the same systematic approach to human utility that characterized everything else in Sparta. Now let us return to that stone room where Melina waits, where the crying of other women filters through walls that suddenly seem too thin. The older woman who conducted her examination is gone. The wax tablet with its mysterious marks has been carried away. Melina is alone with her thoughts and her terror. She knows more about Sparta than most Athenian women. Her husband, Hippocrates, was a military man, a strategos who had fought against Spartans multiple times, who had studied their tactics and their psychology in the way that commanders must study their enemies. He spoke of them sometimes, late at night, when the children were asleep and the wine had loosened his tongue. They are not like us, he told her once. They do not think like us. When I look across a battlefield at an Athenian enemy, I see a man who wants what I want: safety, victory, glory, a return to his family. When I look at a Spartan, I see something else, something that has been emptied out and refilled with purpose. They do not fight to win. They fight because fighting is what they are. She did not fully understand what he meant then. She is beginning to understand now. The door opens. A different woman enters, younger than the examiner, perhaps 30 years old, with the athletic build that Melina has already learned to recognize as typically Spartan. Spartan women exercise. They run, wrestle, throw, discus, and javelin. They are strong in ways that Athenian women, sequestered in their homes, trained only in domestic arts, are not. I am Gorgo, the woman says. I have been assigned to explain your situation. Melina notes that this is not an introduction. Gorgo has not offered friendship or sympathy or even basic courtesy. She has stated her function. Nothing more. You were examined tonight, Gorgo continues. The assessors have determined that you are suitable for household assignment. This means you will be given to a Spartan citizen as a secondary wife. Secondary wife. The phrase is clinical, precise, and utterly inadequate to convey its meaning. Melina knows about Spartan marriage customs. She knows that Spartan wives had unusual freedoms, could own property, could speak in public, could exercise naked alongside men. She also knows that these freedoms existed within a system that treated reproduction as civic duty and women's bodies as state resources. What does that mean? Melina asks. Her voice comes out steadier than she expected. What will be expected of me? Gorgo looks at her with what might be approval or might be mere assessment. You will live in the household of a Spartan citizen. You will be required to produce children. These children will belong to the state, not to you. They will be evaluated at birth. If acceptable, they will enter the agode at age 7. If not, they will be exposed. Exposed. The word means killed, thrown from a cliff or left in the wilderness to die. Children that Melina might carry for 9 months, might labor to deliver, might hold briefly before they are taken and evaluated and possibly murdered. You will also be available to other citizens who request access, Gorgo continues. The E4s encourage genetic diversity. A woman of proven fertility may be requested by multiple households during her productive years. Melina feels something cold spreading through her chest. You mean any Spartan can? Any citizen in good standing may petition for access to any woman, including wives of other citizens. This is normal. This is how Sparta maintains population despite casualties. This is how we produce warriors. Gorgo says this without emotion, without apparent awareness that she is describing something Melina's mind refuses to fully process. To Gorgo, this is simply how things are. This is what her mother experienced, what she herself will experience, what every Spartan woman accepts as the price of their unusual freedoms. What if I refuse? Melina asks. Something changes in Gorgo's expression. Not anger, something worse. Something like pity mixed with contempt. The women who refuse are given to the Crypteia, she says, for training purposes. The silence that follows is absolute. Melina remembers Hippocrates speaking of the Crypteia, describing them as the shadow of Sparta, the young warriors who hunted helots in the darkness. She did not know they hunted anything else. What does that mean? She asks, though some part of her already knows, already understands what training purposes implies. The Crypteia learn to extract information, Gorgo says. They learn to break resistance. They learn what bodies can endure. The women given to them provide education in these matters. Most do not survive the curriculum. Those who do are not capable of further use. She lets this settle before continuing. You are fortunate. Your assessment indicates value for household assignment. You will be given to a citizen who lost his wife in childbirth last year. He has no heirs. You will provide them. Fortunate. The word is obscene in this context, but Melina understands its relative truth. She has been classified as breeding stock rather than training material. She will be violated systematically rather than destroyed experimentally. She will be allowed to live, to eat, to sleep in a real bed rather than a training cell. This is fortune in Sparta. This is mercy in a society that has optimized itself for the production of human weapons. The assignment will be formalized tomorrow, Gorgo says. You will be brought to your new household. You will begin your duties immediately. If you cooperate, if you produce acceptable children, if you cause no difficulties, you will be treated adequately. If you resist, you know the alternative. She turns to leave, then pauses at the door. I will tell you something that we do not normally tell foreigners, she says. because you seem capable of understanding. What happens here is not cruelty, it is necessity. We are surrounded by enemies. We rule a population that outnumbers us 10 to 1 and hates us completely. Every Spartan child that dies in training, every helot we must kill to maintain control, every war we fight against Athens or Thebes or Persia, all of it drains our numbers. We cannot replenish ourselves from our own women alone. We need foreign blood. We need bodies. We need wombs. She meets Melina's eyes with an expression that contains no apology. You will contribute to Sparta's survival, Gorgo says. That is your purpose now. That is all you are. The door closes. Melina is alone again, understanding now what assignment means, what her life will be, what her body will be used for. She does not cry. She has learned already that Sparta does not respond to tears. But in the silence of that room, in the hours before dawn brings the formalization of her new existence, she begins to plan, not escape. Escape from Sparta is impossible, not resistance. Resistance leads to the Crypteia. She plans something else, something that will take years to execute, something that requires her to survive, to adapt, to become what Sparta wants her to be while preserving something inside that Sparta cannot touch. She does not know yet whether this plan will work. She does not know whether anything can preserve a person's essential self through what she is about to experience. But she intends to find out. The question that historians have largely avoided asking is why? Why did Sparta develop these practices? Why did a Greek city, sharing language and religion and cultural heritage with Athens and Thebes and Corinth, become something so radically different from its neighbors? The answer lies in demography, geography, and a choice made 5 centuries before Melina's capture that locked Sparta into a trajectory it could never escape. When Sparta conquered Messenia around 700 BCE, it acquired the most fertile agricultural land in southern Greece. This land could produce enough food to support a population many times larger than Sparta's own. But to benefit from this conquest, Sparta had to control the Messenians who worked the land. The Spartans chose not to expel or exterminate the conquered population, as other ancient societies sometimes did. They chose to enslave them in place, creating the helot system that would define Sparta for the next 4 centuries. This choice had consequences that the original conquerors probably did not anticipate. The helots were not ordinary slaves. They were not purchased individuals from diverse backgrounds, cut off from their origins and communities, unable to organize resistance because they shared nothing with fellow slaves except their condition. The helots were an entire people, enslaved collectively, maintaining their language and traditions and memory of freedom, living on their ancestral land, outnumbering their masters by an enormous margin. They were, in effect, a conquered nation living under permanent occupation. This situation created permanent insecurity. The helots revolted whenever Sparta showed weakness. They provided intelligence to Sparta's enemies. They murdered Spartans when they could get away with it. They never accepted their condition. They never forgot that the land they worked had once been theirs. Sparta responded to this threat by becoming a garrison state. Every Spartan citizen was a soldier, permanently mobilized, permanently ready to suppress helot uprising. Every aspect of Spartan society was organized around this single imperative: maintain control or be destroyed. But maintaining control required numbers, and numbers were the one thing Sparta could never have enough of. The Agoge killed a significant percentage of each generation. War killed more. The practice of exposing weak infants eliminated others. Sparta's citizen population was always small, always shrinking relative to the helots, always dependent on producing maximum warriors from minimum population. This demographic pressure explains the sexual practices that distinguish Sparta from other Greek cities. In Athens, wives were secluded, protected, expected to bear children only for their husbands. A woman's reproductive capacity belonged to her husband's household. In Sparta, women's reproductive capacity belonged to the state. Spartan wives were shared because the state needed every capable womb producing maximum children. Older women were matched with younger men because older women had proven fertility. Younger women were matched with proven warriors because physical prowess was believed to be heritable. The eugenics were deliberate, systematic, and documented in sources that historians have traditionally preferred to interpret symbolically rather than literally. Aristotle, who was no friend to Sparta, described these practices with evident disgust. He noted that Spartan women owned nearly 40% of Spartan land, an extraordinary figure in ancient Greece. But he also noted what this property ownership required. Women who could manage estates because their husbands were permanently in barracks. Women who accepted multiple sexual partners because the state demanded it. Women who watched their children taken at age 7 and could do nothing to prevent it. The freedom of Spartan women was real. It was also the freedom of a breeding population that has been given privileges in exchange for biological productivity. And what applied to Spartan women applied even more intensely to captured foreigners like Melina. Captured women had no property rights, no legal protections, no citizenship that might complicate their use. They were pure reproductive resource, to be distributed according to state needs, to be accessed by any citizen the ephors approved, to produce children who would belong to Sparta regardless of their mother's origins. The children of these unions occupied a unique position in Spartan society. They were not helots because their fathers were citizens. They were not full Spartans because their mothers were foreigners. They were something in between, a category called nothoi or mothakes, depending on the source, with limited rights and specific functions within the military system. Many became officers in helot control units. Others served in foreign campaigns where Sparta preferred not to risk full citizens. Some, if they distinguished themselves sufficiently, could be elevated to something approaching citizenship, their foreign blood diluted by Spartan achievement. The system was coherent. It was logical. It addressed Sparta's demographic problems with the same efficiency that Spartans applied to military challenges. And it required treating human beings, specifically women, as means rather than ends, as instruments of state reproduction rather than persons with inherent worth. This is what Melina was about to experience. Not random cruelty, not sadistic impulse, but systematic use according to protocols refined over generations. She would be fed adequately because malnourished women produce weaker children. She would be housed adequately because stressed women miscarry more frequently. She would be treated, in certain limited ways, better than a helot. But she would be used. That was her function. That was all she was, in Spartan terms. A womb with adequate genetics, captured from a defeated enemy, assigned to a citizen who needed heirs. The household of Cleomenes, son of Anaxandridas, occupied a position of moderate status within Sparta's peculiar social hierarchy. Cleomenes was 34 years old, a veteran of 3 major campaigns, a survivor of the Agoge's brutal filtration. His first wife, a Spartan woman named Lampito, had died 2 years earlier while delivering a daughter who died with her. He had no heirs. Without heirs, his household would be dissolved upon his death, his property absorbed by the state, his lineage erased from Spartan history. Melina was brought to this household on the morning after her assessment, escorted by 2 Spartan women who walked behind her like guards rather than attendants. The house was smaller than her home in Athens had been, but constructed with the same austere functionality that characterized everything Spartan. Stone walls without ornamentation. Wooden furniture built for durability rather than comfort. A central courtyard where the household gathered for meals and religious observances. Cleomenes stood in the courtyard when she arrived. He was not handsome by Athenian standards. His features too sharp, his body too lean, his eyes too flat. But there was something in his stillness that commanded attention, the coiled readiness of a predator momentarily at rest. He examined her without speaking. His gaze moved over her body with the same clinical detachment that the assessors had displayed, evaluating hip width, breast development, the signs of previous pregnancy that marked her as proven fertile. He was choosing a broodmare. This examination was appropriate. "You understand your position," he said finally. It was not a question. "I have been informed," Melina replied. She kept her voice neutral, her expression composed. She had decided during the night that emotion would not help her here. Spartan men were trained to see emotional display as weakness. If she wanted any leverage in this household, she needed to present something else. "You were wife to Hippocrates," Cleomenes said. "Strategos, competent commander. I faced him at Mantinea. He had excellent cavalry tactics." The casual mention of her husband, the professional respect offered to a man Cleomenes' people had killed, cut deeper than insults would have. But Melina did not flinch. "He studied Spartan methods carefully," she said. "He believed understanding an enemy was the first step to defeating them." Something flickered in Cleomenes' eyes. Not anger. Something that might have been interest. "And did you study with him? Did he share his understanding with a woman?" This was a test. Melina recognized it instantly. Spartan women participated in intellectual life to a degree that would have shocked Athenians. A Spartan man might value a wife who could contribute to discussions, who could manage a household with strategic competence, who was more than a silent breeder. "He shared everything with me," Melina said, including his assessment of why Sparta was simultaneously strong and weak. Now, there was definite interest. Cleomenes' posture shifted slightly, the micro-movements that betrayed attention despite his training. "Weak," he repeated. "Athens believed Sparta weak. Athens believed Sparta's strength was its weakness, that the system which produced warriors could not produce enough of them. That time favored Athens because Athens could replace losses, and Sparta could not. That every Spartan who died in battle was irreplaceable, while Athenians were as numerous as the fish in the harbor." Cleomenes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone had changed subtly, becoming something closer to conversation than interrogation. "Your husband was correct," he said. "Our strength is our weakness. We conquer enemies we cannot absorb. We produce warriors we cannot replace. We maintain a system that destroys us slowly, even as it makes us powerful. Every Spartan knows this. None of us can stop it." This was more than Melina had expected. More insight, more honesty, more recognition of shared humanity than she had believed a Spartan capable of offering. She filed it away, this glimpse of a man who thought about his society's contradictions, who saw the machinery that surrounded him, rather than simply operating within it. "You were brought here to address that weakness," Cleomenes continued, "to provide children who will enter the agoge, who will become warriors, who will help Sparta survive another generation. This is your function. I will not pretend otherwise." "I understand," Melina said, "but I am not a cruel man." Cleomenes met her eyes directly. "I do not find pleasure in suffering. I will not hurt you unnecessarily. I will not allow others to hurt you while you are in my household. You will be fed well, housed adequately, treated with what consideration this system permits. In return, I expect cooperation, children, heirs for my household, continuation of my line. And if I provide what you expect, then you will have as much comfort as Sparta allows anyone. You will have a position in this household. You will have, within limits, autonomy over daily matters. You may find, in time, that this life is not what you feared." Melina heard what he did not say. The alternative, the crypteia, the training purposes that Gorgo had described, the fate of women who resisted. "I will cooperate," she said. "I would like to live. I would like my children to live, even if they become Spartans. I would like to survive what has happened to me." "That is reasonable," Cleomenes said. "That is all I ask. Reasonability." He gestured toward a doorway behind him. "There is a room prepared for you. The household women will show you your duties. Tonight, we will begin what you were brought here to do. Tonight." The word hung in the air between them, laden with everything that remained unspoken. "I understand," Melina said again. And she did understand. She understood that this man, who was not cruel, who offered consideration within limits, who saw the contradictions of his own society, would nonetheless use her body tonight and every night, necessary until she conceived. She understood that his decency, such as it was, did not extend to questioning the system that had placed her here. She understood that she was property speaking to an owner, and that the owner's kindness made no difference to the fundamental relationship. She walked through the doorway, followed by the household women, into the life that she would now lead. Behind her, Cleomenes watched her go with an expression that his training had taught him never to show, something that might have been doubt, something that might have been recognition that the woman he had just acquired was not the broken creature the assessors had described, something that might have been the beginning of a problem he did not yet know he had. The nights were what Melina had expected, clinical, functional. Cleomenes came to her chamber after the household had retired, performed what was necessary to produce children with the same efficiency he applied to everything else, and returned to his own quarters. There was no pretense of affection, no attempt at pleasure, no acknowledgement that what occurred between them was anything other than state-mandated reproduction. What surprised Melina was the days. Cleomenes was, by Spartan standards, an unusual man. He spent most of his time in the communal barracks, as all Spartan citizens did, training and eating with his peers. But he returned to the household for portions of each afternoon, and during these periods he talked to Melina about subjects that ranged from military tactics to agricultural yields to the poetry of Tyrtaeus, the Spartan bard whose verses were the only art form Sparta officially permitted. At first, Melina suspected these conversations were another form of control, a technique to keep her compliant through the illusion of intellectual engagement. Gradually, she came to understand something stranger. Cleomenes was lonely. This should have been impossible. Spartans were never alone. They lived communally, trained communally, ate every meal in common dining halls where conversation was expected and silence was suspicious. They were surrounded by peers from childhood to death, embedded in networks of comradeship that replaced family bonds with something harder, more durable, more demanding. But these networks, Melina began to understand, were not the same as human connection. Spartan men were trained to value strength and despise weakness. They could not show vulnerability to each other. They could not discuss doubts, fears, the private thoughts that made them individuals rather than identical units in a military formation. They wore masks of Spartan virtue at all times, around all other Spartans, because any crack in the mask might be reported, might be used against them, might mark them as something less than equals. Melina was not Spartan. She was property. Cleomenes could say things to her that he could not say to any of his peers, because what did it matter what property thought? What could a captured Athenian woman do with knowledge of his private doubts? He told her about his childhood in the Agoge, about the boy who had been his closest friend, who had failed one of the endless tests and been expelled from the training, who had killed himself rather than face the shame of living as something less than Spartan. He told her about the Helot he had killed during his Crypteia service, a young man about his own age who had looked at him with understanding rather than fear in the moment before the blade went in, who had said in perfect Greek, "You are more enslaved than we are." He told her about his first wife, Lampito, whom he had chosen himself from among the eligible Spartan women, who had laughed at his jokes and challenged his assumptions and made him feel for the 4 years of their marriage, like something more than a weapon in human form. He told her how Lampito had screamed for 16 hours during the birth that killed her, how the midwives had refused to help because the baby was positioned wrong and intervention might have saved Lampito but killed the child, and Spartan protocol prioritized potential soldiers over women. He told her these things late at night, in the darkness of her chamber after the functional coupling was complete, when whatever defenses Spartans were trained to maintain had been temporarily lowered. Melina listened. She asked questions. She offered observations that drew him out further, that made him feel heard in ways he had not experienced since Lampito's death. She was, without conscious strategy, becoming important to him. This was not Stockholm Syndrome, though it might have looked similar from outside. Melina did not love Cleomenes. She did not forgive what he represented, what he had done to her, what he would continue to do. But she recognized an opportunity. If Cleomenes valued her beyond her reproductive function, if he came to depend on these conversations, these moments of genuine human contact in a life otherwise devoid of them, she might acquire leverage, protection, perhaps, eventually, influence. Survival in Sparta required adaptation. Melina was adapting. But Sparta was not a private relationship between one captured woman and one lonely warrior. Sparta was a system, and the system had requirements that transcended individual arrangements. 3 months after Melina's assignment to Cleomenes' household, she was summoned to the office of the ephors. The ephors were Sparta's elected officials, 5 men chosen annually who held power that exceeded even the king's. They supervised the agoge, managed foreign relations, controlled the crypteia, and oversaw the distribution and use of captured populations. They were the administrative backbone of the Spartan system, the men who ensured that individual variations never threatened collective function. Melina was not told why she had been summoned. She was simply escorted from Cleomenes' household by 2 crypteia warriors, who walked beside her with hands resting on their daggers, through streets where Spartan women paused their activities to watch the foreign woman being taken somewhere important. The ephor's office was not grand. Sparta did not do grandeur. It was a functional space, 5 chairs arranged in a semicircle, a smaller chair positioned before them for those being interviewed, examined, or judged. 4 of the 5 ephors were present when Melina arrived. The 5th chair was empty. "Sit," one of the ephors commanded. He was older than the others, perhaps 60, with the ravaged face of a man who had survived decades of warfare. "You are Melina, formerly of Athens, assigned to the household of Cleomenes, son of Anaxandritus." "I am," Melina confirmed. "You have not conceived." The statement was clinical, factual, and devastating. 3 months of nightly use, and her body had not produced what Sparta required. She had noticed, of course. Had tracked her cycles with the desperate attention of a woman whose value depended entirely on fertility. Had hoped, each month, that the signs would be different. "Not yet," she said. "I have conceived before. My sons were healthy. I believe I will conceive again." "Belief is insufficient," another ephor said. "Data suggests that Athenian women, accustomed to different diets and activity levels, often require adjustment periods before they become productive in Spartan conditions. We allow 6 months for this adjustment. You have 3 months remaining. And if I do not conceive within 6 months?" The ephors exchanged glances. Something passed between them that Melina could not interpret. "Then we must consider whether household assignment was the correct placement," the older ephor said. "Perhaps you would be more productive in a different context. Perhaps intensive exposure to multiple partners would stimulate conception. Perhaps the crypteia could make use of you after all." Melina felt cold spreading through her body. This was the threat that had hung over her since arrival, made explicit now, weaponized to ensure her compliance. But that is not why we summoned you, the E4 continued. We have received a petition from a citizen in good standing. He has requested access to you for breeding purposes. Under Spartan law, such requests are ordinarily granted without consultation. However, this request is unusual. Unusual how? The petitioner is not seeking to produce children. He is seeking something else. He has specified that he wants you for one night, during which he will perform acts that may damage your breeding potential. He has offered substantial compensation to the state for this damage. Melina's mind raced. Who would make such a petition? What could they want that would damage her ability to conceive? And why would the Ephors consult her rather than simply granting the request? Normally, the Ephor said, we would not inform you. You are property. Your consent is not required. But the petitioner's request is extreme enough that we face a choice. Grant it and lose your productive potential. Deny it and offend a citizen with considerable influence. We have chosen a third option, which is, we give you the choice. Accept the petitioner's use for one night, knowing what it may cost, or refuse, and continue in Cleomenes' household under increased pressure to conceive quickly. We want to know what you would choose. This was not mercy. This was the Ephors shifting responsibility, creating a situation where whatever happened would be Melina's own decision, where they could not be blamed for the outcome. Who is the petitioner? Melina asked. The Ephors exchanged glances again. The older one nodded. His name is Lysandros. He is a captain of the Crypteia. He has specific interests that he prefers to pursue with foreigners rather than Spartan women. Melina understood then. The Crypteia captain was a sadist. He wanted to hurt her, specifically, personally, in ways that went beyond training purposes into something purely individual. He had resources to compensate for the damage. He had influence enough to make his petition difficult to refuse. And the Ephors were offering her a choice that was not really a choice, because both options ended in suffering, but one suffering was familiar, and the other was unknown. I choose to remain in Cleomenes' household, she said. I will conceive. I will provide what Sparta requires. The Ephors nodded, as if this answer was expected. You have 3 months, the older one said. Do not waste them. Melina was escorted back to Cleomenes' household, her mind churning with new fears, new calculations, new understanding of how precarious her position truly was. That night, when Cleomenes came to her chamber, she did something she had not done before. She participated. She moved with him, responded to him, created the illusion of mutual desire rather than passive acceptance. She needed to conceive, whatever it took, whatever it cost her. The alternative was Lysandros. The petition from Lysandros was not an isolated incident. It was, Melina gradually learned, part of a pattern that ran throughout Spartan society, a darkness beneath the darkness that even the systematic cruelties of official policy could not entirely contain. Sparta produced warriors. This was its purpose, its identity, its reason for existence. But the process of producing warriors also produced men who had been systematically stripped of empathy, trained to inflict violence without hesitation, taught that certain categories of human being existed only for use. Most Spartans channeled these capacities into approved activities: combat, helo control, the competitions and training exercises that consumed their days. But some developed appetites that the official system could not satisfy, appetites that required victims. Appetites that the Crypteia, with its access to captured women designated for training purposes, could sometimes provide. Lysandros was one of these. He had risen through the Crypteia ranks, not despite his cruelty, but because of it. He was effective at breaking helots, at extracting information from prisoners, at teaching younger warriors the techniques of interrogation and control. His methods produced results. His appetites were known, but tolerated because his value to the state exceeded the cost of his excesses. Melina learned about him from the household women, who spoke in whispers when Cleomenes was absent, who shared information with her because she had become, in their eyes, something between a fellow servant and a mistress they could not quite despise. "He had a woman last year," one of them told her. "A Theban. She was assigned to household duty like you. Lysandros petitioned for her. The ephors granted it because her owner had no influence to object. She was returned after 3 days, what was left of her. What happened to her? She lived for 2 more weeks. She did not speak during that time. She did not eat unless forced. She died of a fever that the physicians said was caused by internal injuries. Some said she welcomed the fever. Some said she caused it herself, somehow." Melina absorbed this information with the cold calculation that had become her default mode in Sparta. Lysandros was a threat, but he was a known threat. She could plan around him. She could ensure that her value to the state exceeded the cost of offending him. She could make herself too important to damage. But this required producing what Sparta wanted: children, heirs, future warriors for a system that had destroyed everything she loved. She increased her efforts with Cleomenes. She requested permission to consult with Spartan midwives about techniques to encourage conception. She adjusted her diet according to their recommendations, eating more meat and less grain, exercising more vigorously to match the activity levels of Spartan women. And she began, carefully, subtly, to cultivate Cleomenes' affection. This was the most dangerous part of her strategy. Spartans were not supposed to form emotional attachments beyond loyalty to the state. A Spartan man who became too attached to a woman, especially a foreign woman, would be mocked by his peers, questioned by the ephors, potentially stripped of status. But Cleomenes was already unusual, already lonely, already isolated by the very sensitivity that made him capable of seeing Sparta's contradictions. Melina needed only to deepen what already existed, to make herself so necessary to his emotional life that he would protect her even against the ephors' pressure, even against Lysandros' petitions. She asked him about his campaigns. She remembered details from previous conversations and referenced them later. She offered observations about tactics and strategy that drew on her husband's knowledge, that positioned her as an intellectual companion rather than merely a breeding vessel. She laughed at his rare jokes. She touched his arm when they spoke. The touches were key. Spartans were not accustomed to casual physical affection. Their society was built on violence, competition, the physical dominance of training and combat. Gentle touch that offered connection rather than demanding submission, was genuinely foreign to them. Cleomenes responded to it the way a man dying of thirst responds to water. He began finding reasons to return to the household earlier. He began lingering after their nightly encounters, talking in the darkness, sometimes falling asleep beside her, rather than returning to his own quarters. The household women noticed. They did not comment, but Melina saw the knowing glances, the recalculation of her status within the domestic hierarchy. More importantly, others noticed as well. Lysandros submitted a second petition 4 months after Melina's arrival. This time, Cleomenes was informed, and Cleomenes, to the ephors' evident surprise, objected. She is productive potential, he argued, using the language that Spartans understood. She has not yet conceived, but she will. I have invested resources in her adaptation to Spartan conditions. Damaging her now wastes that investment. She has only 2 months remaining before reassignment is considered, one of the ephors pointed out. If she fails to conceive, your investment is lost, regardless. Then, let us wait until that determination is made. If she proves unproductive, Lysandros can have her. If she conceives, her value is established, and his petition should be denied. The ephors considered this. Cleomenes was not an influential man by Spartan standards, but he was a citizen in good standing, a veteran, a man whose opinion carried weight even against a Crypteia captain. 2 months, they agreed. If she has not conceived by then, the petition will be granted. Cleomenes returned home and told Melina what had happened. For the first time since her capture, she saw something like fear in a Spartan's eyes. "You must conceive," he said. "I cannot protect you otherwise. Even my objection has raised questions among my peers. They wonder why I care what happens to a foreign woman. They wonder if I have become attached." "Have you?" Melina asked. The question hung in the air between them. Cleomenes did not answer directly. "Conceive," he said. "Whatever it takes, conceive and live." That night, Melina prayed to Hera for the first time since her capture. She prayed for fertility. She prayed for a child she would not be permitted to raise, who would be taken at 7 and broken in the agoge, who might grow up to conquer and enslave other women as she had been enslaved. She prayed because the alternative was Lysandros. And Lysandros was worse than anything she could produce for Sparta. The gods, or chance, or her body's desperate response to impossible pressure, granted her prayer. 6 weeks before Lysandros's petition was scheduled to be granted, Melina missed her monthly bleeding. She waited 2 more weeks to be certain, then reported to the household physician, who examined her and confirmed what she already knew. She was pregnant. Cleomenes received the news with visible relief. He reported to the ephors, who recorded the pregnancy in their meticulous records, and denied Lysandros's petition on grounds that the subject was now demonstrably productive and should not be damaged. Lysandros accepted this decision with the outward compliance that Spartan discipline demanded. But Melina heard from the household women that he had been seen watching Cleomenes' property from a distance, that he had made comments to other Crypteia officers about unfinished business, that his interest in her had not diminished, but only been deferred. She was safe for now. The pregnancy protected her. The child growing inside her, the child of Cleomenes' systematic use, the child who would become a Spartan warrior or be exposed on Mount Taygetus, that child was her shield. But pregnancy ended. Children were born. And then, what protection would she have? She began thinking further ahead. She began considering what she would need to survive, not just the next months, but the next years, the next decades, the rest of her life in this place that had consumed everything she was. She would need status. She would need children who survived the birth inspection, who entered the agoge, who became warriors. The mother of warriors had value in Sparta. The mother of multiple warriors had significant value. If she could produce enough sons who survived, she might acquire enough importance that even Lysandros could not touch her. But she would also need Cleomenes. Need him alive. Need him protecting her. Need him present to object to petitions and argue before ephors and provide the shield of his citizenship against those who saw her only as foreign flesh. This meant keeping him healthy in a society that sent its citizens to war regularly, that valued death in battle as the highest honor, that would call him to the front whenever Sparta's endless conflicts required warm bodies. It meant, she realized, that she wanted him to be a coward, wanted him to survive battles that better Spartans died in, wanted him to choose life with her over glorious death for Sparta. And she realized, with something approaching horror, that she could make him want that too. She had already begun the process without fully understanding it, the conversations, the touches, the way she had made herself necessary to him. She could continue. She could deepen his attachment until it overrode his training, until his desire to return to her compromised his willingness to die heroically. This would be the ultimate transgression against Spartan values. Not her own survival, which Sparta expected and even required, but turning a Spartan warrior into someone who valued his own life, who might flinch in combat because flinching meant coming home to her. She would be corrupting him, destroying what the agoge had built, making him less than Spartan. She would be taking revenge on the system by subverting one of its products. In the darkness of her chamber, her hand resting on her belly where new life was growing, Melina made a decision. She would do it. She would corrupt Cleomenes. She would make him love her in ways that Spartans were not supposed to love anyone, and she would use that love to keep him alive, and she would use his protection to survive, and she would produce children for Sparta that she could not keep, and she would endure everything else because endurance was victory in a war she could never win directly. She would become what Sparta needed her to be on the surface, while remaining something else underneath. And if she was very lucky, if she lived long enough, if Cleomenes survived long enough, she might someday find a way to escape, or she might not, but she would survive. That was enough. That was everything. She slept that night better than she had since her capture. The war had changed form, but it was not over. The child was born in the spring, 7 months after the pregnancy was confirmed. A boy, healthy by initial inspection, with Cleomenes' dark hair and Melina's lighter eyes. The birth was difficult, but not dangerous, attended by Spartan midwives who had delivered thousands of children, and who treated Melina with the professional competence they would have shown any breeding female. The inspection came 3 days later. Elders from the council examined the infant with the same clinical detachment they applied to every newborn, checking limbs for straightness, joints for flexibility, lungs for capacity. They measured and weighed and prodded, the baby screaming at treatment that must have seemed designed for his distress. Melina watched from across the room, not permitted to hold her child during inspection, not permitted to object if the elders found him wanting. She kept her face neutral, her hands steady, her terror invisible. Cleomenes stood beside her, equally tense beneath his Spartan mask. The elders conferred briefly. The oldest one turned to face them. "Acceptable," he said. "The child will be registered. He will enter the agoge at 7 years." Melina felt her legs weaken with relief. Her child would live. Her child would be taken from her in 6 years and transformed into a weapon, but he would live. In Sparta, this counted as good news. They named him Pleistarchos, meaning ruler of the masses, a name that carried traditional prestige in Spartan society. Melina was permitted to nurse him for 2 years, the standard period before children were weaned and mothers became available for renewed breeding. Those 2 years were the closest thing to happiness Melina experienced in Sparta. Pleistarchos was a healthy child, active and curious, quick to laugh and slow to cry. She poured into him all the love she could not show openly, all the tenderness that Sparta did not permit between adults, all the humanity she was fighting to preserve in herself. She also used those years to deepen her hold on Cleomenes. The presence of a child softened him further. He spent more time in the household, more time watching Pleistarchos develop, more time in conversations with Melina that wandered far beyond military matters into philosophy, history, the arts that Sparta disdained, but that Cleomenes had secretly always wondered about. He told her that he had considered, as a young man before the agoge had fully taken hold, becoming something other than a warrior. He had enjoyed the poetry they were required to memorize, had wondered what it would be like to write rather than merely recite, had imagined a life where creation mattered as much as destruction. "That is weakness," he said, as if reminding himself. "A Spartan creates through war, through victory, through children who become warriors. Any other creation is distraction." "Is it weakness to imagine alternatives?" Melina asked. "Or is it wisdom to understand that other ways of living exist, even if one chooses not to pursue them? In Sparta, there is no difference. To imagine alternatives is to weaken commitment to the reality we must live. This is why we have no art, no philosophy, no literature beyond war songs. These things create doubts, and doubts kill soldiers. Then why do you speak of them with me?" Cleomenes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Because speaking with you does not feel like weakness," he said. "It feels like breathing, like I have been holding my breath for 30 years and finally am permitted to exhale." This was the moment Melina had been building toward. The moment when she could have pushed further, could have asked what else he might want to do if breathing was permitted, could have begun openly suggesting that Spartan ways were not the only ways, that survival could matter more than glory. She did not push, not yet. The foundation was not complete. She needed more time, more conversation, more of the slow erosion that was wearing away his Spartan certainties. And she needed more children. The second child was conceived within months of Pleistarchos' weaning. Another boy, born healthy, passing inspection, named Archidamos. The third came 2 years after that, a girl this time, who the ephors debated before, ultimately permitting to live because female children were needed to produce the next generation of breeding women. They named her Kiniska, meaning puppy, a traditional Spartan name for girls that reflected the society's view of female children as useful animals rather than fully human persons. Melina called her other things in private, whispered Athenian endearments that the child would never understand but that Melina needed to speak. Through these years, Lysandros remained a shadow. His petition had been denied, but his interest had not disappeared. Melina heard reports of him through the household network, mentions of other women he had acquired, descriptions of what happened to them that made her grateful every day for the children who protected her. He rose through the Crypteia ranks. He became one of the 5 captains who directed the secret society's activities. He accumulated influence that made him dangerous to cross, that made even ephors hesitate before denying his requests. And he watched. Always, when Melina appeared in public, when she walked to the market or attended religious festivals or accompanied Cleomenes to civic functions, Lysandros was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. The years had not diminished his interest. If anything, they had intensified it. She had become, for him, unfinished business, a conquest deferred, a pleasure anticipated. Melina knew this. She prepared for it. She ensured that she was never alone in public, never unaccompanied, never vulnerable to the kind of sudden acquisition that had happened to other women in Sparta. She cultivated relationships with Spartan women who had influence with the ephors, who could speak on her behalf if Lysandros attempted to force the issue. And she continued her work on Cleomenes. By the time Pleistarchos turned 6, the year before he would enter the Agoge, Melina had achieved something that should have been impossible. Cleomenes loved her. Not the functional connection of a Spartan husband to a useful wife, not the territorial attachment to a valuable possession, but something real, something that involved her personhood rather than merely her utility, something that made him think of her when he was away, that made him anxious for her safety, that made him hesitate. This hesitation was beginning to show. In training exercises, Cleomenes no longer pressed attacks to their final conclusion. He fought effectively, but not recklessly, preserving himself in ways that his peers noticed and commented on. He had become, in Spartan terms, cautious. Caution was not a virtue in Sparta. Caution was what helots showed, what cowards displayed, what men who had lost their commitment to glory demonstrated before they were stripped of citizenship and cast out. Cleomenes' peers began distancing themselves from him. His standing in the communal dining hall declined. Younger warriors felt comfortable challenging him in ways they would not have dared 5 years earlier. Melina observed this deterioration with mixed feelings. She had wanted to protect him, to keep him alive, to ensure that her shield remained intact. But the protection was costing him status, influence, the position in Spartan society that made his objections to the ephors carry weight. If he fell far enough, his protection would mean nothing. If he was expelled from the homoioi, she would be reassigned to another household, or, worse, finally given to Lysandros as the unfinished business he had been waiting for. She had created a trap for both of them. His love protected her from immediate danger, but exposed both of them to longer-term destruction. The year Pleistarchos entered the Agoge, she sat with Cleomenes in the darkness of her chamber and told him the truth. "You are changing," she said. "Your peers see it. The ephors see it. If you continue as you have, you will lose your citizenship, and I will lose you, and everything we have built will be destroyed." Cleomenes was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice held pain that Spartans were not supposed to feel. "I know," he said. "I have known for some time. The training teaches us to ignore our instincts, to override the part of us that wants to survive rather than achieve glory. I overrode it for years. I was an excellent soldier because I did not care whether I lived or died. But now you care. Now I want to return to you. Every battle, every training, exercise, I think about what will happen to you if I am killed. The thought makes me hesitate. The hesitation makes me weak. The weakness endangers both of us more than the caution was supposed to protect." Melina reached out and touched his face, the gesture that had begun her campaign years ago, that had become natural between them. "What do we do?" she asked. "I do not know. I have tried to recover what I was, but it is gone. You have replaced it with something else, something softer, something that Sparta cannot use. I am no longer a proper Spartan. I am something else, something that has no place here." This was the moment, the culmination of years of careful work, the moment when Cleomenes admitted, out loud, that he was no longer what his society had made him. Melina should have felt triumph. She had won, in a sense. She had corrupted a Spartan warrior, turned him away from the values that had brutalized her, proved that the system could be subverted from within. Instead, she felt grief for Cleomenes, who would now pay the price of loving her, for herself, who had created the weapon that would destroy them both, for the children who would grow up without either parent, Pleistarchos already in the Agoge, the others soon to follow. "There is one option," Cleomenes said slowly. "One way that a Spartan can leave Sparta without disgrace. It requires sacrifice, but it might allow you to survive after I am gone." "What is it?" "War. Glorious death in battle. If I die heroically enough, my household retains its status. My widow, even a foreign widow, would be protected by my legacy. My children would be honored rather than shamed. You would be safe from Lysandros because attacking the widow of a hero would bring dishonor on him rather than glory." Melina understood what he was proposing. He would die for her. He would find a battle, charge into the enemy lines, sacrifice himself in a way dramatic enough to be remembered, and his death would become her protection. "No," she said. "It is the only way. I have thought about this for months. There is no other solution that preserves both your safety and my children's honor. This way, everyone gets what they need. Sparta gets a hero, my children get a legacy. You get protection, and you get death. I was always going to die in battle. Every Spartan expects this. Every Spartan is trained for this. I am merely choosing when and why, rather than waiting for chance to decide." Melina felt tears on her face. She had not cried since her capture. She had trained herself not to, had understood that tears were weakness that Sparta would exploit. But this was too much. This man, who had been her captor and her user and somehow, impossibly, something more, was proposing to die so that she could live. "I will not let you," she said. "You cannot stop me. I am still Spartan enough for that. Then I will stop you by giving you something worth living for, something beyond me, beyond the children, beyond anything Sparta offers." Cleomenes looked at her with confusion. "What could you give me that I do not already have?" Melina made a decision. The final decision, the one she had been building toward without knowing it. the culmination of everything she had learned about Sparta and about herself in the years since her capture. "Escape," she said. "Not death. Escape. Both of us. Together." Escape from Sparta was not supposed to be possible. The helots who attempted it were hunted by the Crypteia, captured, tortured, executed publicly as examples. The Perioikoi, the free non-citizens who lived in Spartan territory, were permitted to leave but had nowhere to go that Sparta's reach could not follow. For a Spartan citizen to flee would be unprecedented. The shame would extend to his entire household, his ancestors, his descendants. It would be worse than death, worse than any other fate Sparta could impose. But Melina had spent 8 years observing Spartan systems, identifying their weaknesses, imagining alternatives that no one else considered because no one else had her combination of outsider perspective and insider knowledge. She had identified a possibility. Every year, Sparta sent embassies to other Greek cities, to foreign powers, to allies, and enemies alike. These embassies were staffed by Spartans of good standing who served as diplomats, negotiators, observers. Some of these missions took months. Some went to places far from Greek territory, to Persia, to Egypt, to the edges of the known world. A diplomat who defected while on mission would not be abandoning Sparta. He would be betraying it, which was different in ways that mattered to Spartan psychology. Traitors were despised, but they were also acknowledged as having made a choice rather than merely fleeing. Their families were not automatically shamed. Their property was not immediately confiscated. There were procedures, investigations, delays. During those delays, a family could disappear. Melina had also identified a contact. One of the Spartan women she had cultivated, a woman named Gorgo, the same Gorgo who had explained her assignment on that first terrifying day, had become something like a friend over the years. Gorgo's husband was one of the ephors, which gave her access to information about diplomatic missions, about timing, about opportunities. Gorgo had her own reasons for helping. Her daughter, Arachne, had been given to Lysandros 3 years earlier. What was returned could not properly be called alive. Gorgo wanted revenge, and Melina had offered her a way to achieve it, helping an escape that would humiliate Lysandros by removing his long-anticipated prize from his reach. The plan took 2 years to arrange. Cleomenes had to be assigned to an embassy, which required patience and manipulation of the kind Gorgo understood. The embassy had to go somewhere that offered sanctuary, which meant coordinating with Athenian representatives who had their own reasons for wanting to humiliate Sparta. The children had to be quietly moved from the agoge and the household, which required bribes to helots and perioikoi who could be trusted because they hated Sparta as much as Melina did. The night before the embassy departed, Melina gathered her children in her chamber and told them what was happening. Pleistarchos was 14 now, 7 years into his agoge training, already bearing scars from the beatings that had shaped him. Archidamos was 12, following his brother's path through the system. Kiniska was 10, old enough to understand what she was hearing. "We are leaving," Melina told them. "Tomorrow, your father's embassy departs for Athens. We will follow by a different route and meet him there. We will never return to Sparta." Pleistarchos looked at her with eyes that were already hard with the training that had been inflicted on him. "Father is betraying Sparta," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, that is wrong. Everything we have been taught says it is wrong. Everything you have been taught was taught by a system that enslaves human beings, that throws imperfect babies from cliffs, that turns children into weapons. Is that system worth loyalty?" She watched her son's face as he processed this, watched the conflict between what the agoge had installed and what he had known before, in the first 7 years when she was still permitted to love him openly. "I do not know," he said finally. "I do not know what is right anymore." "Then come with us. Find out what you think when you are free to think it." Decide later whether you want to return to Sparta or make a different life. Pleistarchos nodded slowly. Archidamos and Caniska had been watching in silence, following their older brother's lead. When he nodded, they nodded too. The escape happened exactly as planned. Cleomenes left with the embassy. Melina and the children departed 2 days later, guided by helots who knew paths through the mountains that Spartans had never bothered to learn because helots were not supposed to know anything worth knowing. They reached Athenian territory after 6 days of hard travel. They found Cleomenes waiting at the rendezvous point, having defected from the embassy on the 2nd day when they reached a crossroads that offered him a choice between duty and family. He had chosen family. On the night before she died, she asked Cleomenes to help her walk to the roof, where they could see the stars that were the same stars they had watched from Sparta, from the chamber where she had been held, from the darkness where she had planned and plotted, and refused to accept the fate assigned to her. "I never thanked you," she said, "for choosing us over Sparta, for giving up everything you were trained to be. You gave me something better than what I was trained to be," Cleomenes replied. "You gave me the ability to choose. Spartans are not supposed to choose. We are supposed to be what we are made to be. You unmade me and let me choose what to become instead. Do you regret it? Ever? I regret the years before you. I regret what I did during my Cryptia service. I regret the women who were given to my household before you arrived, who I used without thinking about their humanity. I do not regret anything that happened after you changed me." Melina leaned against him, feeling the warmth that had replaced the coldness she first encountered in that courtyard 40 years ago. "We won," she said. "Not the way warriors win, with death and glory, but we won. We survived. We lived. We produced something other than weapons." "Yes," Cleomenes said. "We won." She died that night, in her sleep, in the arms of the man who had been her captor and her user, and finally, impossibly, her partner in escape. Cleomenes lived another 5 years, long enough to see Pleistarchos' philosophical works begin to circulate, long enough to hold great-grandchildren, long enough to tell the story of their escape to anyone who would listen. The story spread. It became famous. It became one of the examples that later historians would cite when discussing the cracks in Spartan society, the ways that even the most systematic attempts to eliminate human emotion could not entirely succeed. Sparta itself continued for another 2 centuries, gradually weakening as its population declined, as its systems failed to adapt to changing circumstances, as the very rigidity that had made it powerful made it brittle when challenged by opponents who could innovate and change. When Sparta finally fell, when its territory was absorbed into larger powers and its distinctive systems were abolished, some historians pointed to stories like Melina and Cleomenes as evidence that the fall was inevitable, that any society that tried to eliminate human emotion, human connection, human capacity for love, would eventually be undermined by those very things. Whether this analysis is correct remains debated. What is not debated is that Melina existed, that she survived, that she found a way to remain human in a system designed to destroy humanity. Her story was written down by Pleistarchos, preserved in texts that survived the destruction of ancient libraries, passed down through generations of scholars who recognized something important in this account of one woman's resistance. She could not defeat Sparta. She could not save the thousands of other women who were captured and processed and used and discarded by the system that had claimed her. She could not prevent the helots' suffering or the children's brutalization or the endless wars that consumed Greek civilization. But she could survive. She could preserve herself. She could find one Spartan who was capable of being reached, and she could reach him, and together they could escape. That was her victory. That was her revenge. That was what she left for the women who came after, who faced their own impossible systems, who needed to believe that survival was possible even when everything seemed designed to prevent it. Remember her name, Melina, wife of Hippocrates of Athens, captive of Sparta, survivor. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand ancient Greece from what they learned about Thermopylae and the 300. Because the 300 died gloriously, but Melina lived, and sometimes living is the greater victory. The years that followed were not easy, but they were free. Athens had been rebuilt after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. It was no longer the imperial power that Melina remembered from her youth, but it was still Athens, still the city of philosophy and art and commerce, still everything that Sparta was not. Cleomenes struggled to adapt. The skills that Sparta had given him were not useful in Athenian society. He could not farm, could not craft, could not engage in the trade and negotiation that Athenian life required. For the first years, he was dependent on Melina's family connections, on the charity of relatives who remembered her father and were willing to help his daughter despite the strange Spartan she had brought with her. Eventually, he found a role. Athens needed soldiers, and Cleomenes knew warfare better than any Athenian. He became an instructor, teaching military techniques to young Athenians who would never master them the way Spartans did, but who could learn enough to defend their city. He was not happy, exactly. The shape that Sparta had given him could not be entirely erased. He woke some nights from dreams of the agoge, of the crypteia, of things he had done that no amount of freedom could undo. He remained harder than Athenians, more comfortable with violence, more direct in ways that sometimes made social interactions difficult. But he was alive. He was with Melina. He watched his children grow into something other than what Sparta would have made them. Pleistarchos rejected warfare entirely. He became a philosopher, studying at the academy that Plato had founded, writing treatises on ethics that questioned the values he had been taught as a child. His work on the nature of justice, influenced by his experience in both societies, became required reading for generations of students. Archidamos became a merchant, traveling throughout the Mediterranean, building connections that made him wealthy by Athenian standards. He married an Egyptian woman, had children who grew up speaking 3 languages, who knew nothing of Sparta, except the stories their father sometimes told. Kyniska surprised everyone. She became an athlete, competing in the games that Greek cities held, winning prizes in events that were normally closed to women. She argued that Sparta, for all its horrors, had given her physical training that no other Greek woman received, and she intended to use it. Melina lived to be 63 years old, ancient by ancient standards. She watched her grandchildren play in the courtyard of the house she shared with Cleomenes, watched the life she had built from the ruins of the one that was destroyed.